Hello, my name is Steve Messiah, and I am an electrical engineer at the Department of Defense. I work for the Navy, and I am doing a presentation today on time management for engineers. I've been an engineer for about 13 years, maybe. Yeah, about 13 years. I graduated from UCR back in '03, and learned a few things, and so I want to share those with you all. And please join in or please follow along. Okay, so the agenda today. Why is time management important? Who is your priority? What is your priority? And I have a personal example of time management, and also want to discuss a few time management tips for engineers. Okay, so let's get started. Why is time management important? Well, for one, when you manage your time, it'll save your company money. Your customers will return when your work is accomplished on time, and when you meet deadlines, your customer will feel that, and they'll want to come back to you. And eventually, this will end up equating to more profit. I mean, your company is going to have more business if your customer is happy. So that's one part. Um, on the flip side, mismanaged time can result in delays. Your customer will definitely know if there's a delay and if the schedule is being pushed. And what that'll mean in the future is less opportunity. Ultimately, your customer basically is going to go to someone else for future work. I know for myself, if I'm standing in line and it's taking too long, then I just feel like at the store, I feel like they're not doing their job. So then I'm just going to go somewhere else and buy what I need to buy. So it's kind of that type of thing. Customer definitely feels when who they're paying is not doing a good job. So getting the job done essentially comes down to more time for get more time for other business opportunities. And so when you finish early, while you're probably not going to sit there twiddling your thumb, when your project is done, you're probably going to get more work, and so it will give you more opportunities. Another thing is your personal reputation. So um, with a little bit of experience, I've come to realize that people gain a reputation when they can get the job done, and your peers especially will catch on that you're one of those people that get things done, or if you're one of those people that aren't able to get the job done on time or efficiently. So that perception is very important at work, and that's something you want to keep going. So um, that's a big part is your how you're viewed among your peers. In addition, your managers may prefer a different coworker for the same task in the future. So um, you don't want to be the one that failed, and suddenly you're not having the same opportunities because your coworkers now are performing better than you are. You want everybody to be performing well, and you want to be a go-to guy in your field. Um, Another thing is you'll realize this in your future tasks. You'll find that at companies where I work, I've noticed it myself, but um, future tasks can become more mundane. So you have employees that you work with, and they might be given a very difficult project, and if they're not succeeding with it, they may end up on a less difficult project, and eventually, if they're still not doing well, their tasks are just going to be undesirable. They're going to be doing something just in order to to be on the clock, to be contributing in one way or another, even though whatever task they're doing might not be engineering anymore. It might not be anything that significant. I have an example here. I do know a coworker or two that that used to be engineers, and they still are, but they spend a lot of their time um, working on supporting other people's projects. So instead of being the lead engineer, they'll be helping other engineers. Um, and another person that I know, not saying names, but another person I know, they now help more with the contracting and buying process, which is not really a role of an engineer, but it's one of the problems, one of the, I don't want to call it a punishment, but it's something that happens when you're not good in your field. And engineering is difficult, and so if you can't contribute as much in engineering, you may find yourself doing other tasks that support the main goal of the company, but at the same time are not they're not going to be as desirable. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to discuss priorities a little bit. And the thing about priority is you have priorities in terms of who your customer or your audience is, and you have priorities in terms of your tasks. So one thing that isn't talked about as much is your priority in terms of audience. And so I wanted to catch on that a little bit before I discuss your task priorities. Okay, so who is your priority? What will make you happy? What will make management happy? Or what will make the customer happy? Oftentimes, they're not the same thing. Should you prioritize your tasks that impress management, even if there's no real benefit to the customer? Sometimes management wants to see very detailed material, very in-depth designs. Is that what your customer is really looking for? Is that where you want to place all of your time? What if you have a moral preference? What if there's a certain way you want to do something? However, the customer will be happy if you kind of cut corners on some things that may provide ethical challenges for you, and so that's another trade-off. Really, the key with priorities and people are to know what it is and who it is you're supporting and who you care about, because you don't want to make the customer happy but not make your management happy, and suddenly you're not getting a raise because you spend all your time on something that the customer wanted and not on something your managers were looking at. But you don't want to do vice versa, because you may make your managers happy, but eventually if your customer isn't, they're going to complain to your managers. So you're going to want to balance that out as well. And the bottom line is to make sure you know who it is you're trying to impress, and make sure that your time is spent on those tasks. Okay, now that we've discussed the audience, I wanted to talk a little bit about tasking. What is your priority? And so most people have seen this before. It's a very basic understanding of how to prioritize tasks. But it's a model by Stephen Covey from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And essentially, there are 4 quadrants. There are things that are urgent and important, not urgent and important. There are things that are urgent and not important, and then finally in quadrant 4 is not urgent and not important. So essentially, you want to keep everything in the top half. You want to make sure that you're doing the things that are important, and the main idea here is to keep as much as you can in quadrant 2, where things are important but not urgent. So, for example, if your baby is crying, you kind of have to stop what you're doing. So, even if you're doing something that's important, if it can wait and you have a crying baby or you have a kitchen that's on fire, you're going to stop what you're doing no matter what to resolve those, because those have to be done ASAP. Um, Now, in quadrant 2, which is where you really want to live, is doing things that are basically proactive and preventative. So, exercising, planning ahead, making decisions that um, don't have an impact right away, but what they're doing is they're preventing things from becoming urgent in the future. So it's kind of you're doing a lot of your preventive tasks in there, and that's really where you want to be. Quadrant 4 are things that come up, but they're really not important, and so you want to keep tasks and things that are in quadrant 3, for example, distractions, phone calls that just aren't important, interruptions. You want to keep those to a minimum, because they can creep up on you, and they can um, essentially put things that are in quadrant 2, which are not urgent but are important. They can delay those until they do become urgent. And so you want to avoid that. And also in quadrant 4, not important and not urgent. Those are things that just are, they're kind of tedious. It's fun, and kind of look at it as a waste of time, but it's also something that if you do have all the time in the world, it's okay, but it's not where you want to be very long. And so when it comes to any tasking at all, this is kind of a basic discussion, a basic lesson about priorities and tasking, but try to keep your things and try to keep your tasks in quadrant 2, where they're not urgent but they're important, and that you're constantly doing things to prevent things from being urgent. Okay. Now, I have an example here. Having worked for the government for a few years, I've been able to understand how we have challenges like every organization has challenges, and engineering has challenges wherever you go. But one example I wanted to use has to do with procurement and purchasing. Um, so within my organization, I can't just go out and buy anything I want, and I can't just make a design in my mind um, and start buying things for several $1,000s. It's not the way it works. Probably not the way it works anywhere. Um, However, we have a policy at work where you can't buy anything without completing a project design review. So I have to have a drawing package, and I have to have in it, I have to have engineering diagrams, a schedule, and a bill of materials that show what it is I'm trying to buy. I have to match those materials with components in the engineering diagrams, and those diagrams have to be, um, sized correctly. All considerations have to be made. So we basically put this in front of a panel where they can look and discuss and basically give a yay or nay on if we can move forward. And so that's one thing that it's a good piece to have. It's important, but keep in mind that you can't move forward on your project without having this design review. And so um, taking the appropriate time and um, making this design review successful is important. Otherwise, you're going to waste time because now you have to go another couple of weeks redesigning your system before you can represent it again to get that approval. And so get the drawings done correctly so that you can impress your managers and basically start buying materials. You're on the clock, right? So you need to start buying things before you're going to get paid whether you do it right the first time or the second time, but definitely management will take notice if it's taking longer than expected to have the drawings prepared. Okay, so important to keep in mind that a design review is meant to help the success of the project. It'll ensure that the project and the system is designed the best possible way from the eyes of the subject matter expert. So the objective is to design and then buy everything right the first time. So it's there to help and put the focus on the drawings and on the design and on your list of materials, present it, and buy. So it's not really an inefficiency, but I want to show how in the next slide it leads into a bit of an inefficiency. So one issue with our procurement process is we may have too many cooks in the kitchen, I call it, but it's a policy. So what happens is, I have a list of materials. Finally, it gets approved to buy, from the design team, right, for my presentation with them. And then basically, depending on the dollar amount, I basically send this list of procurement to a procurement bubble, we call them, a group of people that are on one email distribution. And basically, they determine, well, if the dollar amount is above this much, you have to go to contracts. And so that'll be a different group of people that'll have to take control of it. If it's below a certain amount, is it something we have? Is it something we've bought before? There's a whole slew of processes that are involved with buying something. So sometimes something that's only $10 might need approval from 5 managers and the safety people. So like there are times where it becomes frustrating, and so that's why they do make it important to buy things right the first time. Things that it depends on, the contracting team's workload. If the contracting team has a ton of procurement to make at the end of the fiscal year, for example, then my project may be delayed, and here I am sitting on the clock, wasting time, basically waiting for my material to come in, but that can't come in if the contracting team has too much work to do. Now, what if the government contracting process is taking a while? What if there's an issue with the contract being awarded? If the competition is too much, not enough, if nobody bids on the contract, if the person that bids on the contract promises more than they can deliver. So you have multiple moving parts in the procurement process, and really it's difficult because when you can't control the time of that, it's a huge variable, it's a huge ambiguity. A few other challenges. Well, constantly pinging people for approval. You need documents to be signed by multiple people, and so if it goes in one person's inbox and The person whose inbox your form is in that needs to be signed went home for the day or the week. Well, then you have to wait a little bit. So you need to find an alternate person to approve, and it's a bit of a tedious process. Okay, so basically, those are some of the challenges involved with buying, and it's important, no matter how difficult it gets, to stay patient and poised with everybody that's involved. Um, you want to be professional. You don't want to show that you can't be patient. There's a way and a time to approach people to get things done, but Um, it's important to be professional so that people care and want to help. Um, Now, the solution to this issue is something we've been doing at work, and it's been going pretty well. So what happens is, as soon as I put my procurement items, my list, into the bubble to get purchased, well, I don't know if it's going to take a month or 2 weeks. But what I can do is, at that point in time, I can approach my boss and say, hey, all of my materials have been pushed to be purchased. I need a new project. And so what happens is, now I've taken on simultaneous projects while one is on hold. I'm working on a different project. That's kind of a trick we've been using to make sure that we're busy all the time and that we're not sitting there waiting for parts, but we're working at the same time. So simultaneous projects is one key way to get around that, and one way to manage our time in that. Another thing is, when I left that project that's waiting for items to arrive, I've left it designed well enough so that if I'm not back in time to take it on when materials do arrive, that somebody else can look at the design and can actually move forward with that project and can obtain the appropriate contracting resources for that project to move forward without me, or at least with minimal effort from my part at that point. So that's another tip we've been using as we design these projects and have them set up for procurement. Okay, so moving on, I want to discuss scheduling a little bit. Um, it's important to ensure that the project schedule is feasible early in a new project. So talk with your project manager and make sure that all the tasks, if you need to shuffle around the tasking in order to meet the schedule and to optimize the schedule, because you don't want to work on something or wait on something that you can't do while something else can be done. And so there are some tasks that are contingent on each other and some that are not. And it's important to put the tasks that are contingent early, so that if you're waiting for something, you can move to the non-contingent tasks and work on those while you're waiting for the ones that do have multiple contingencies. So another thing with scheduling is, you want to set up an Outlook calendar. You want to be able to ensure that you're not scheduling things around holidays. You don't want to make important decisions when people aren't available, especially managers. Um, some projects require management and subject matter expert approval. So without that, you're not going to get anywhere. And if they've gone for vacation or they're out on a project and you can't have that meeting you need or those meetings to discuss critical parts of your design, well, what are you going to do at that point? You're wasting time. So you need to communicate your schedule with everyone on the team, set up that shared calendar, and ensure the calendar is updating and sending updates to everybody, because that's a key. Without communication and scheduling, it's very difficult to stay on task. Team makeup, so team composition essentially. If you're setting up a team, keep in mind that the size of the team and the team members are important. So you want members that are complementary. You don't necessarily want 5 electrical engineers in power systems. You might want 1 or 2. You might want 1 or 2 comm guys. You might want somebody who's an infrastructure guy. You're going to want a project manager, and you're going to want contractor support, maybe a draftsman. So you want to select your team according to them being complementary to each other, and not to members that are identical or that have extremely similar backgrounds that are just more people without that diversity. And so that's how I would pick a team. Understanding project priorities and flexibility. Does everyone on the team have a role? Is the project on a time crunch? Do we need the sharpest people on the team, or can the project serve as a mentoring opportunity for a new hire? So, um, if you have a project that has very good funding, it's not on a time crunch, it doesn't have, it doesn't have people that are sitting there calling every day, finding out where is this, what's the status of the project, and it's not something with super high visibility. Well, it might be an opportunity where you can mentor a new young employee and take advantage of the fact that funding is there and it's a little bit lax, slightly more lax of a project, or at least do some kind of R&D on that. You can buy subcomponents to a system that you may have not tried before because you have a little bit of room for error. So those are a couple of things that you might want to do, but just understand what the customer is looking for and design your team accordingly. So sometimes you have flexibility with your team members, sometimes you need the sharpest tools to be on the team. So it's important to determine that early. And another thing is, as you try to stay on schedule with this, you want to look at your team members and you want to know how much time people can spend. So if somebody is having a baby, well, that might not be a good employee to put on this high-profile job project. And if somebody is able to work overtime, if they can work extra hours to complete the tasks, great. That's a good benefit. If not, well, you might not be able to have that person on the team. So to talk a little bit more about overtime, one thing I wanted to say is this is important because at work, I mean, you can spend a lot of time paying somebody for overtime. So it can be a two-edged sword, and let me explain. So the great thing about overtime is it provides a means for employees to complete project tasks with fewer days. So instead of doing something in 10 days, I could probably do it in 7 if I'm working, say 10 to 12-hour days. Hardworking employees that need a few extra hours can take advantage of this. They get paid more, plus the project gets done sooner. So it's a win-win situation. And, they can get the tasks done on time or ahead of schedule. But on the flip side, and this is something I've seen as well, is people can abuse the overtime privilege. And let me explain. So if I can get rewarded for doing the same job I would do in an 8-hour day, but do it slower and complete it in 10 or 12 hours, well, now I'm making overtime work backwards for me because I'm working extra hours, but am I really working my hardest? And it's very difficult to work hard in an 8-hour day. So to work hard in a 12-hour day means it's grueling, and you really you just want to watch that and make sure that your employees are working as hard as they can if they're on the clock, and make sure overtime is being used correctly and on the for the benefit and not the disadvantage of progress. So a solution to that I want to discuss is a couple of solutions are to communicate the urgency of completing the tasking. So if the person that you're working with is going to work extra hours, you need to communicate how important it is that the task gets done. Make more noise when things are urgent or important. It's a very powerful tip when something is important to communicate that urgency and not to you don't want to make too much noise all the time. You want to communicate that, and that's not just for overtime, but that's for anything in general in the workplace when you're working with others. When you make noise, it can have power, but you don't want to over-abuse it. And so this is one case where it might be important to make a little bit more noise when something is urgent and needs to be completed by a fellow coworker or a contractor or whoever it is. Okay, back to the overtime. So communicate the moral goal of the organization. So, you work for the Department of Defense and the Navy, and you want to help, and you have a mission. And so you want to be a good steward of the nation. So you want to communicate that as well as a goal in terms of being a good steward of your time. Another thing is to work hands-on with the employee. So if I've communicated the urgency and I feel like things are still not getting done, well, an example that I have that I did is I booked a conference room with the draftsman, and I basically said, hey, me and you tomorrow, 10 hours in this room, we're locked in, and we're not going to stop till it's done. So by doing that, I was effectively able to work side by side with the draftsman. So anytime they had questions on anything, they can ask me, and it's not a whole process of call me, wait till after lunch, for a lunch, a small change, maybe he doesn't want to call. So we sat next to each other and we hacked away at this to finalize some of these drawings. And together we were able to get it done. And I let him know, hey, manager's going to be looking at this tomorrow. We can't leave this room until it's done. So that was a strategy that worked for me. Now, a couple of tips that I want to discuss. Well, not just a couple, several tips I want to discuss are one, to identify the showstoppers. So buying expensive items that take longer than normal to arrive. You want to know those early. So if you have something that costs $50,000 and you've got a bunch of small items that cost $50, well, chances are the $50,000 one might arrive after a much longer time. So you don't want, you probably want to put all of your, as much of your time as possible in that process of buying that item than in buying other items. Are any of your items hazardous? Are there chemicals involved? You might have to involve your safety office and get their approval. Are you doing any trenching or digging or anything on the job site? For electrical grounding systems, some sites you go to, they won't let you dig or trench. Some will. And, it kind of comes down to, we joke around about saving the endangered desert tortoise. But that's the reality of it is that's something that needs to be considered. And if you try to find out too late, you may not be able to dig or trench, and your grounding system may, for electrical engineers out there, power guys, that's resistance to ground might not be good enough. And so you may have to have a difficult meeting with your customer to let them know late in the game that you can't build a system to spec because of that. And so that's important to discuss early. It would be risky to deploy a system like that may be dangerous. Another tip is to handle small tasks quickly. So make sure you grab low-hanging fruit. Anytime you can get a quick win, it'll help build your confidence and just help you throughout the project. So always grab something that you can complete and check the box so you can keep that process moving, where you can kind of create that culture of getting things done. If it takes 2 minutes or less, and this is something I've read and I believe it to be true, but if a task takes 2 minutes or less, it's better to just get it done than it is to prioritize, because you actually spend more time trying to prioritize. So remember, 2 minutes or less, just do it. More than 2 minutes, prioritize it. Know when it's better to buy a product than to spend the time designing it. This is something very difficult for engineers. We like to build everything, and as soon as we see a green light in terms of building something and the capability we can provide by building, one of these components or designs, it's very difficult to buy it and substitute it in. Well, we oftentimes want to dig in the weeds if we have to. We want to just figure it out. And, it takes a lot of time to do that. And sometimes, when you're designing a component or a subcomponent, you just have to let go. Cut your losses and say, hey, I spent 5 days trying to, build this thing that already exists, and it's just a very small part of my entire project that the customer wants. So why don't I just buy it at this point? Cut the losses, buy the parts you need, and make sure you have a system that'll work. And one solution for this is to assign time limits to everything. So ensure that the project has a good project schedule, and if a task takes too long, just stop what you're doing and find another way to get it done, because it'll hurt you in the long run if your schedule slips a lot because of something that you're narrow-minded and you focused really hard on trying to figure something out that ultimately didn't get done and pushed everything behind schedule. Okay, I want to mention a famous quote here, and this is from Abraham Lincoln. And what he says here, and this is a tip, what he says here is, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. So that's Abraham Lincoln. So essentially, when the moral here is, when you're given a project, think about it, think about the approach, think about the challenges, and focus your effort on the important stuff. Because no matter how much time you have, it doesn't really matter if you're not using it correctly. So If you have, and it's true. If you have an old axe and you just start chopping down trees, you might not chop down that many trees. But if you sharpen this axe so well, and you only spend 2 hours chopping down trees, you may actually get more trees chopped. So I like that quote, and I just wanted to share it. Also wanted to mention something about the lazy programmer. I've heard several times, and it appears to be true, that lazy programmer actually makes a good programmer. They spend less time programming, but somehow they're better. Well, turns out that you can write a program maybe that'll take a couple of pages of code, but it's actually a lot harder to do that in a half a page. And so a lazy programmer doesn't want to sit there typing all day, and they don't want to make things. They don't want hundreds of lines of code if they can get it done less. And so it turns out that that smaller code runs more efficiently, can use less resources, and it's just a better program. So more time working on something doesn't necessarily mean more efficient time. You can get more done in less time if you do it the right way. Okay, another tip is to ask for help. So it's another difficult thing for an engineer to do, but sometimes you just have to ask people for help. It's perceived as a sign of weakness, um, but it could really help save a project that's in need. It could help you save time on tasks that are smaller, so you can focus on the big tasks. So just to be constructive to the project, make sure you get people involved if you're stuck. People are always willing to help. Notify a coworker, a supervisor if you have an issue. If it doesn't get resolved, hold a meeting where multiple people are together so they can chime in. A lot of times people speak up when they have other people around them to kind of help boost. So you don't want to be the guy who drops the ball at the end and then share your weaknesses and struggles throughout. If you're gonna mess up something in your project, you'd rather have gone out, gone out fighting and gone out asking and trying to get help than to not. And chances are you'll get the help you need, and the project will be back on track. So I would recommend that. Another important tip is delegating. And so delegating, if you're a technical lead or a manager, you're gonna need to delegate, and you're gonna need to know how to do it. The purpose of delegating is basically to relieve you, a manager or technical lead, of work that a subordinate employee is capable of doing. Manager doesn't have to do everything. In fact, if they do everything, their employees are going to sit there not doing much, and really they're just going to be overworking themselves, and they're not going to get as much done. So really, a manager should be giving tasks to people so that things can move forward and that they can divvy up tasks, gives them more time to divvy up more tasking. The benefit to the employees, it's a chance for them to develop their skills and be given more problems, and so it gives them confidence. A good approach for a manager or lead is to provide increasingly difficult assignments. So start small and give an employee a task that might not take as long, and if they do it well, then it's a good time to give them a more difficult task. So that's just a good tip when you're giving someone a task. I mean, you give them something too hard and it doesn't work out, well then you're kind of lost. Is it your fault for doing that, or is it their fault for not completing the task? Okay, so I want to mention something else here. The manager must realize that the subordinates will make errors, just as managers do, and learn to trust subordinates as they gain skill. And that's from our book for the class, and it's a book written by Morse, engineering management book, and it's on page 167. So that was a quote from there. I'll read it again. The manager must realize that subordinates will make errors, just as managers do, and learn to trust subordinates as they gain skill. Okay, another tip is related to drop-in visitors. What do you do when you're working and somebody just drops into your cubicle or your office? I mean, it consumes a lot of your time. You need to learn the fine line between helping a coworker and wasting time on nonsense. If it's your boss, you can't really get away. But if it's somebody else, just keep busy. Turn and work on your computer. Maybe they'll get the hint. That's a possible solution. Occasional small talk is acceptable, but try to focus on work-related discussions. So gear the discussion towards something that might help resolve a solution of something you're working on or that they're working on. That's another tip. And also, if someone's going to be dropping in, maybe it's better it's you, because it's a lot easier to sneak away when you're talking to someone else in their environment than it is if they come to see you in your office. Then so basically, it's better to be the one who's walking in than to be the one who's walked in on. Okay. Another distraction in the workplace is social media and fantasy sports. I find myself doing this, constantly checking Facebook, Instagram, my fantasy football team, adding players, to my team, or dropping players from my team, and it takes a lot of time. And one strategy for that is to designate a time during lunch for that type of work, we'll call it, but for that type of games. It could be a distraction and a hindrance to some of your more important work tasks. So I just wanted to close with a list here from our textbook that talks about common time wasters. This is a list, and many of these items we've discussed, and some we have not, but I do want to just share this list with you. So common time wasters are inadequate, inaccurate, or delayed information, ineffective delegation, phone interruptions, meetings, unclear communication, crisis, leaving tasks unfinished, indecision and procrastination, drop-in visitors, and lack of self-discipline. So if I didn't cover it already in the presentation, then these are additional um, time wasters to look at, and hopefully we can all find ways to minimize the time wasters and to understand the importance of managing our time, not only in the eyes of our peers and our coworkers, but also in our ability to get things done and to be accomplished people. So time management is very important, and there are times you have to find ways to minimize delays in your projects and your processes, but it's worth it. And in the end, you'll be a better engineer if you can find ways to stay busy and focus on the work that you need to get done. Thank you very much.